Welcome to today's webinar, Risks, Considerations and Conversations about Safety when Domestic and Family Violence Comes to Work. My name is Carly Hanson. I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators here at Community Legal Centres Queensland. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar. In Brisbane, they're the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the very important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As today's webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a really warm welcome to any First Australians who are joining us today. So I'm really pleased to welcome Kerry-Anne Deer, who is wearing many hats, but one of those is as one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators here at CLCQ. She'll be talking to us today through a work health and safety lens, providing some practical steps that workplaces can take to help manage risk to keep employees safer. Today's session will have a particular focus on the issues associated when workers are working from home, particularly during the COVID pandemic, as many of us are. So I'll let Kerry-Anne tell you a little bit more about herself when I hand over in just a moment. But before I do that, just a quick bit of housekeeping. So today's session is being recorded and we'll have that recording available for you to download later today. The PowerPoints have been sent out, or a link to those have been sent out to everyone who registered this morning, and that you can also download those from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll have questions at the end, but feel free to pop your questions into the question box at any time throughout the session as you think of those questions. And we can deal with those all at the end, either verbally or I can read them out for you. So I'll now hand over to Kerry-Anne to take us away on this session. Thank you, Kerry-Anne.
Thanks very much, Carly, and thanks everybody for joining the presentation today. We hope that it's beneficial to you, and we also want to make you feel safe during the presentation. So if acknowledging the high rate of domestic and family violence in our community, some of the material may be disturbing or upsetting, and if you feel triggered or upset by the material, use your own discretion as to whether you want to continue watching or reading or listening to the material. And there are some referral resources available on the Community Legal Queensland website if you Google that, and keep safe. I'll stay online for about 10 minutes at the end if anyone's got any particular questions or referral information that they'd like, or if you just want to have a general chat after we finish the actual presentation. So I'd like to acknowledge that this has been a joint effort between Community Legal Centres Queensland, where I'm a Sector Sustainability and Development Coordinator, as is Carly, and the Services Union, which has been my union for, I think, about 25 years, and also DV Work Aware, which is a program of the National Working Women's Centres, which in Queensland is hosted through Basic Rights Queensland, also a community legal service. The funding for the presentation and some other resources that I will point you to at the end of the presentation has been made possible through a grant to the Services Union from the Office of Industrial Relations. So we'd also like to acknowledge the Queensland Government for that support. So the webinar today covers why domestic and family violence is a workplace issue. It looks at the impacts of domestic and family violence on employees and co-workers, particularly with safety and well-being. And there'll be some practical information to guide you to develop workplace risk assessments and to undertake safety planning at work as part of an overall domestic and family violence strategy. I don't take a deep dive into the definitions today, and neither am I looking particularly at industrial entitlements. They've been covered in a previous webinar that was hosted by Community Legal Centres Queensland about 12 months ago, which is available on their website and to which all participants, I understand, were sent a link. So just quickly, what is domestic and family violence? It's a pattern of abusive behaviour, it's always repeated, and it occurs in an intimate or family type relationship where one person uses the violence motivated by a desire to dominate, control or oppress the other person in a way that causes fear. Violence threatens the victim's physical health, often housing, security and mental well-being. People exposed to violence are at a greater risk of developing a range of health problems and are more likely to report poorer physical health overall and engage in practices that may be harmful to their own health. And while family and domestic violence cuts across socioeconomic groups, it's reported at higher rates amongst disadvantaged Queenslanders. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men report having experienced physical violence by a current or former partner since the age of 15, and women are 8 times more likely to experience sexual violence by a partner than men. So we know that men and LGBTIQ people may also be less likely to report the violence, and we know that the disproportionate impact is on women and children, who are typically more than 3 times more likely than men to experience violence, also from an intimate partner. Some particular groups in our community are more vulnerable and have complex or intersecting issues such as race, gender, disability, ethnicity, or might experience barriers to seeking help. We know that people with a disability are 1.8 times more likely to have experienced physical or sexual violence from a partner. So violence may be cyclical. It may appear to be fixed or disappear from time to time. And we also know that in relation to the workplace, both victims and perpetrators often hide or minimise the violence in social or work settings. We know that there's a lot of evidence pointing to a significant driver of domestic and family violence being gender inequality. And for First Nations people, the experience of racialised structural inequality and the ongoing impacts of colonialisation with high exposure and tolerance of violence means that an estimated 25% of First Nations people experience 1 or more incidents of physical violence in the past 12 months. There's some particularly good resources that Our Watch host. That Let's Change the Story, developed a few years ago, and more recently Change the Picture, which is targeted at the prevention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So we're going to focus today on when domestic and family violence comes to work. We know domestic and family violence can be a workplace issue. It's been widely recognised now with the awarding of universal access to leave, and we know that 60% of workplaces around Australia now actually have a policy, or those who report to WEGA, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, say that their organisations have a policy that deals with domestic and family violence. So domestic and family violence can become a workplace issue when a perpetrator or someone's partner or ex-partner or a family member attempts to harm an employee at work. In some cases, there might be a risk to the physical and psychological safety of the person, but also to other people who might be working in that workplace. So some circumstances in which domestic and family violence may present a work-related risk might be physical or verbal abuse between partners employed at the same workplace. There might be threats to a person or the person's co-workers at their particular workplace. It could be harassment or attacks on a person or co-workers at their workplace, either through phone calls, emails or visits. It could be stalking a person at work, and in most extreme cases, domestic and family violence related homicide in the workplace. So the impact, in summary, means that it can have issues for both victims and perpetrators of domestic and family violence. It can relate to reduced productivity. It can relate to high staff turnover. There are workplace health and safety responsibilities, which we're going to dive in today. But it can also mean things like workplaces may have to have a greater commitment to gender equality and respect in order to address some of the underpinning drivers of domestic and family violence. So domestic and family violence can actually have a really significant impact on an employee's health and well-being, on their productivity, their attendance, as well as being a potentially an issue that can pose safety risk for all employees. According to a KPMG 2016 study, it costs employers approximately $175 million a year in all of those attribute areas. So we've had a couple of pieces of research, one in 2011, the Safe at Home, Safe at Work survey by the University of New South Wales, and more recently 2019 Insight report into the impact of domestic and family violence at work, which mirrored each other in some ways, but The 2011 report talked about employees reporting that they were scared not only for their own safety, but the safety of others at work. They often talked about their attempts they made to try to manage the abuse and minimise the impact at work. Co-workers often said they felt helpless and unsure about what to do. And obviously there was impacts on attendance or ability to work. So for other workers, there was comments about having to fill in for unproductive or absent teammates. There was feelings of resentment and gossip when the cause of the violence or the behaviours wasn't actually known, or when victim blaming occurred. There was reports of trying to prevent the victim from unwanted contact, and reports of vicarious trauma, and also identifying perpetrators in the workplace, obviously, attempts to screen those harassing phone calls or contacts. So we also know that when it came to disclosing, the 2019 study found that when it came to disclosing domestic and family violence at work, there was actually quite low rates of disclosure to employers. There were slightly higher rates of disclosure to co-workers or managers, but approximately half the employees in the study didn't know if their employer had a policy. And those who said that they had disclosed said that it wasn't a particularly positive experience, and they found the disclosure extremely difficult. So all of this has pointed to developing a domestic and family workplace strategy to help keep employees safer, but also to, at a community level or at a more social level, try to put in effective prevention measures and ensure that any responses to domestic and family violence are appropriate. So there's quite a number of things that employers can actually do. And today, while we are taking a deeper dive into some of the aspects of safety, some of the things that can be done is to communicate domestic and family violence as a workplace issue and make it clear that the workplace is actually supportive of any employees who may be experiencing domestic and family violence. Obviously, the introduction of policies and procedures to minimise the risk of harm is important. Consulting with employees around their perceptions of risks, and assuring employees about their right to confidentiality and support if they do disclose. It's important that workplaces also look out for signs that their employees may be experiencing or engaging in perpetrating domestic and family violence, and also communicate the availability of entitlements such as domestic and family violence leave and flexible work practices and other supports. Referrals are a really important aspect, and taking steps to support an employee by providing access to specialist support such as domestic and family violence services, counselling and financial and legal advice. Obviously, we want some secure protocols around reporting incidents of domestic family violence or suspected incidents, and definitely wanting to encourage behavioural change where there's a possibility that an employee is actually engaging in domestic and family violence. So some of the benefits to workplaces can actually be quite profound, not only for individuals, but it's good for organisations' reputation. It can guide the response to both employee disclosures about experiencing violence and responding to violence. It can foster gender equality and influence positive cultural and behavioural change. And of course, it can help meet workplace health and safety obligations. So the Workplace Health and Safety Act places the primary health and safety duty on a person conducting a business or undertaking. This person or persons must ensure, so far as reasonably practical, the health and safety of people, of workers in their workplace. And this is really underpinned by an organisational commitment. So how your organisation actually tackles the issue of safety around the potential risks of domestic and family violence can vastly differ across industries, activities and locations, and therefore there is no one-size-fits-all approach. But by integrating a strategy-led approach from the highest level, I'm talking from the board or management committee, senior management, the chances of achieving the intended outcomes, i.e. that would be hopefully that no one at work is harmed by domestic and family violence at the workplace, and even more broadly that domestic and family violence is tackled as a social level, is important that it's actually part of the governance framework that supports ethics, compliance and risk management. Obviously, this is a whole rabbit hole that we can go into, but I just thought I might point out some of the levels that domestic and family violence strategies can be implemented at. And that's leadership, and then obviously there's delegations about roles and responsibilities. There's taking planning opportunities to address the risks and, articulating how workplace health and safety objectives might actually be realised. There's a practical support that could be provided. There's the operational level of actually planning and eliminating hazards and managing change management. And then obviously evaluation and continuous improvement are pretty important. So going back to the practical level again, this is a bit of a checklist that you might like to have around your policy. It could be that one policy covers all of these aspects, but it's important to acknowledge that areas include workplace health and safety, that no adverse action or no discrimination will be taken because of the impact of domestic and family violence on an employee. A critical incident or debriefing policy is useful, and obviously a records keeping policy is pretty important to handle how incidents are recorded, but also how confidentiality and the privacy of information is important, is recorded. Also, record keeping can be pretty important for evidence. So evidence that DVOs may have been breached, or if a person is attempting to gather information to support a domestic and family violence claim, then evidence that the workplace collects can be quite useful. So in Australia, and this is quite recent, that Safe Work Australia have actually named domestic and family violence as an area that employers must stand up and take notice of. Employers are expected to ensure that their workplace is basically a safe place, and this includes extends to when a workplace is at a worker's home. Employers need to take a systematic approach to this, and in the event that, this is what Safe Work said when COVID-19 started, that it's not actually possible for the worker to be safe at home, an alternative work environment must be provided so far as reasonably practicable. So Safe Work is actually recognised, and I've put the link in there to their website, this is their most current information, that domestic and family violence can become more frequent and severe during periods of emergency, such as COVID-19, and that public health measures to reduce the spread of COVID-19, such as self-isolation and working from home arrangements, could actually increase a worker's exposure to domestic and family violence. Financial pressures, increased stress and disconnection from support networks might also exacerbate the underlying conditions that could lead to violence. So this recognises that the risks might be outside an employer's control, such as where a worker chooses not to disclose or doesn't inform the employer that home is not a safe place. But it emphasises the need to identify hazards, to assess the risks and control the risks. And it firmly says you must consult with workers on psychological and physical hazards and risks in the workplace and on how to manage them before you make decisions in relation to your control measures. This means that workers will then be best placed to know what the issues are for them, and they will also have ideas on how issues of risk might be managed. So I'm going to talk briefly in a moment about a recent case where a workplace death actually was found to be domestic and family violence, sorry, a domestic and family violence killing was actually found to be a workplace death. And it really highlighted the need for workplaces to consider the impact of DFV on their employees. The reference to that case is at the bottom, and I'm going to talk more to that after I've talked a little bit around COVID. So whether we're in COVID or not, there's some general workplace safety responses that employees can take to domestic and family violence. So these can include just really practical things, and obviously this is going to be very contextual. It's not going to be possible in a retail space or where there's public access to separate your employees. But if possible, clearly identify who's a worker in your workplace and who's not. And I think many of our workplaces have got name badges and processes and protocols around that. Ensuring that the building is as secure and controlled as possible with duress alarms if they're appropriate. And in having emergency procedures in place for instances of domestic and family violence or other violence, and protocols around when it might be important to involve the police. Things like supporting flexible work arrangements or adjustments to work can be useful, as can assisting with safe transport options to and from work. So being prepared also to do practical things like changing email addresses or phone contacts if employees are being harassed at work, and identifying a safe place for workers to go if an incident actually does occur. There's also things like lighting and CCTV and things that you could brainstorm in your own particular workplace to think, well, what could be the risks here, and how can we put in general measures to keep people safer? So the United Nations, Monash University and the New South Wales Women's Safety Survey all recently confirmed that the increased risks of domestic and family violence around COVID are very real. So we've had an over 30% increase in reports to most services around Australia, and that's been a trend that's been reflected internationally. Family violence workers have also been reporting new forms of violence, including perpetrators demanding that women wash their hands and body excessively to the point that they bled, and spreading rumours that victims of the violence had COVID-19 so that nobody would come near them. Some of the DFV workers also reported that perpetrators were not letting women out of their homes in order to protect them from coronavirus, and were also using restrictions as an excuse to stay with ex-partners. So seeking assistance could also be or raising flags for help could also be quite inhibited when you've got increased perpetrator vigilance. So some practical workplace responses could be to not target particular employees, but provide all employees with up-to-date training and education, making sure that you've implemented a policy if you have it, or develop one if you don't, about the impact of domestic and family violence, and that, you know, the fact that it is actually a workplace issue. Consulting with workers individually, if possible, about their particular home arrangements, and guiding them to manage risks at home while they're working there, and also letting them understand that any information that they do disclose will be treated confidentially. So it could be important to provide an option to work not from home, so an alternative workplace, whether that's in your actual office or workplace, or whether that's another arrangement if the person has disclosed that working from home is not a safe thing for them to do. Providing mechanisms where they can report concerns, providing unique and safe logins if they've got work computers or accessing work material, and making sure that your managers are equipped to not only recognise and understand the impact of domestic and family violence, but the need for privacy, and to have skilled conversations and to provide support. I like the Recognise, Respond and Refer framework that's been promoted by a number of organisations, in particular the Queensland Government. And DV Workaware likes to add SSS, which is secure employment, support for the employee, and safety. So if you like alliterations, there might be some things that might be useful too when you're thinking about what you can do. So at an operational level, a workplace health and safety plan involves an assessment of risk, and this is designed and implemented to enhance the general safety of people at work. So once again, it's very contextual, and it will be a case by case. But a first step can actually be at the operational level. Even if you haven't had disclosures or don't have a high awareness of domestic and family violence in the organisation, undertaking a risk assessment process can be a very useful tool. If there is a deemed safety risk to an employee or to others at work, then a workplace domestic and safety violence plan can actually also be developed at an individual level with that staff member, or with other people, including people like security or teams, and that should be conducted by a trained manager or supervisor, HR person or contact officer. And that's one of the resources that we have actually developed in conjunction with the Services Union, with the funding from Office of Industrial Relations, is a template for an individual workplace health and safety plan. While there's no panacea, and you know, all workplaces will be different, it guides because the importance of answering quality questions to extract quality information to guide any safety planning exercise. So the first step really, when you're looking at your risk assessment, and different organisations have different approach, but gathering the information about the potential risks that might impact on your workplace. It could be helpful at the same time to think about risk factors, so things that might actually increase the access of perpetrators, whether you could be in a retail or public premise. Licensed premises, for instance, might have particular risk. Whether you work with high-risk clients, people coming into your workplace could be not only related to domestic and family violence issues, but also potentially other violence issues or injury to workers. Whether workers work alone, whether they work from home, along with considering personal risk factors for people. So being a woman's obviously a higher risk factor generally than being a man. Being an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander woman is an increased risk. Risk also increases around separation, around pregnancy, when there've been threats about violence, when there's possession of weapons, a history of violence, and can also be correlated with mental health and substance abuse issues, though none of those factors alone is the cause of domestic and family violence. So the second step then is evaluation, thinking about how your workplace can actually manage the potential risks of harm. Could the risk be actually avoided altogether? Or, in what ways could we make the risks less serious if they did occur? So while it's great, of course, to have paperwork and policy around the issues, and a really effective way to evaluate your risk is to talk to employees about the issues surrounding domestic and family violence. You get an idea too about issues around gender and equality and what people actually think about the issue just by having these kind of conversations. So then you develop your risk reduction plan where you implement your findings, and of course it's important to review and update and monitor to see whether your strategy or your plan has been effective. So just a little bit about controls. You might hear that terminology, controls or precautionary measures. It really means or action that actually decrease the likelihood that a risk might occur. And if they do occur, that the impact of the violence is reduced. So I'll give you an example. Having a CCTV or security codes to enter the workplace might actually act as a deterrent for someone threatening to disrupt the workplace. So if you put in that as a control, you know that it may be an effective measure, but once again, you would want to measure, how that actually works in practice. But at the same time, it might be important to remember that some of those domestic and family violence behaviours might be more insipid than physical presence, and they might be related to cyber stalking or monitoring, and things like hacking, sabotaging or installing spyware or software can also be issues for people in their workplaces. So once you've decided what control measures you're going to put in to keep your workers safer, you do need to put them into action. Appoint responsible people to ensure the actions are carried out, and you've got to ensure that they're actually realistic and can be achieved within specific timeframes. But once again, I really emphasise that sharing your findings throughout the process and consulting with employees about the risks and measures is a really essential tool, not only to raise awareness, but also to buy in ownership of safety at work. So this is a really simple, and I've seen some pretty complex ones in my travels around Australia working with organisations, but this is a very simple example of a risk register and assessment process. And in this example, I've just used, well, what's your risk description? We're talking about domestic and family violence, entering the workplace through an unwanted contact. What might be the scenario? It could be a scenario that an employee has disclosed that this is happening, or there's risk that it's happening, or it could have been they could have been intercepted by third parties. You take a look at your existing control. Well, we've got policies and procedures, we've trained our staff, we have a code of conduct, but we've also got strategies for phone and digital communication. We've got CCTV and security codes. Then it's important to also assess the likelihood of that actually happening and what the impact might be. And just because I've only got one column here, it doesn't mean that these actually couldn't be two columns and couldn't be extensive, because once you start to look at impact, that's when you really start to see what harm could occur and what could that harm actually mean to our workplace, to our organisation and to the people who work here. And then you look at the actions to take. So it might be that even though you've got your controls, you might be constantly engaging with employees in accordance with the policy. You might be offering individual safety assessments to actually help increase increase safety or decrease the risk of that contact occurring. And you might do things like ensuring that employees have got access to specialist services, things that might be quite practical, but can assist them in addressing the violence. So if you're moving to an individual assessment, and once again I said we've got quite a comprehensive tool that's available for this, what might be some of the information that you need to gather? This can actually be up-to-date contact information, asking the person what sort of support might be needed or might be helpful, asking them what they see as the possible safety risks, including is there a domestic and family violence order in place, and does it actually include the workplace? Making sure, and this can be part of safety planning and your general response, that they're aware of their industrial entitlements and how to access them. That you check in with how their workstation is set up, so if they're at home or if they're at work, that their email and their phone are secure. That travelling to and from work is as safe as it can be, and there's discussions around things like car parking or, start and finish times, accessing public transport. And really importantly, recognising that domestic and family violence can really impact on work and performance, and that reasonable adjustments and perhaps a work plan is actually adopted to support that person through this time. Flexible work practices is another option, and obviously talking to them about how information will be shared. Upholding confidentiality is really, really important, but discussing the circumstances that confidentiality might need to be breached. For example, if there is actually a safety risk or safety issue to the person or people at work. And it might be useful also to obtain relevant information about the person using the violence or the perpetrator. So it might be the provision of a photo or description of the person, what might be some of the characteristics of the violence that the person has directed towards the workplace, or things that the person is comfortable, the employee is comfortable sharing generally. It's not about knowing all the details about the violence, and it's pretty important that these conversations are really contained in a way that the person feels that they're not forced to disclose any information that is personal or that they don't want to, but that the focus is on safety at work and on support for that person. And in doing this sort of assessment, specialist domestic and family violence services can actually be really helpful. They can be aware of some of the issues that may not be so apparent, and they can provide quite valuable insights into safety planning. And asking the person if they are engaged already with a domestic and family violence service, or if they would like a referral to a service, can be quite an important conduit to helping that person also develop a personal safety plan to stay safer in their personal life. So some of the things that might arise out of an individual safety plan could be changes to work patterns, putting in reporting procedures, sign-ins, technology screening, increased security in TV, or including the workplace in a domestic and family violence order. I think I mentioned that, so I won't repeat that. But there's also a couple of other things that are general, probably tips to consider. And one is reviewing the security information that's held by the workplace, including all the details of kin or emergency contacts. The second is making sure that all staff know, without breaching confidentiality, that they should never divulge personal information about employees to callers or to members of the public, including whether the employee is at work or not, including their address, phone number, or patterns of their working hours or their rosters. It's important to establish a communication method with the employee in case of absences or unexpected absences. And with the person's consent, inform work colleagues on a need-to-know basis and agree on the best response if the person who's using the violence contacts the workplace or attends the workplace. Link the employee not only to specialist services but to employee assistance programs if that's available through your workplace. It is really important just to note that where domestic and family violence actually constitutes a criminal act, such as a breach of protection orders or an assault, these do become responsibility of the police, and reporting these instances should be done accordingly. So this is more an area where we delve into specialised training. Usually it's a half-day training where we take a deeper dive into the dynamics of domestic and family violence and how to talk to someone at work when there's a reasonable suspicion that they might be experiencing domestic and family violence, or when they've actually disclosed. So just as important as what information you collect is how that information is collected. And your role in doing this may vary from being perhaps the initial contact person who refers to someone else at workplace, or that person may identify you as a trusted confidant, and you may find yourself receiving a full disclosure about domestic and family violence. So they might disclose to you a very minimal amount of information about why they're late for work, or things that have actually been, apparently been upsetting them or concerning them. But it also could be you who broaches the conversation if you've seen things that are concerning, and just asking that question, are you okay? Is everything okay? While I don't think it's probably appropriate to say, are you experiencing domestic and family violence? Questions like, is everything okay at home, are quite acceptable. So just some general guidelines, maintain confidentiality, but act on safety concerns. Provide help to secure support at work, and get those referrals to specialist services. Believe what the person tells you, and that comes back to listening without judgment and taking seriously what they say. Ask the person what they would like you to do for them or with them. Ask about safety at work. Ask if they do have any concerns about their safety or the general safety of the workplace. Guide them obviously to the key people in the workplace who are trained in this area. Don't give advice, that's pretty important. And focus on the facts relating to the impact that domestic and family violence is having at work. So once again, I said this is a pretty in-depth training exercise, but those tips are pretty important, as well as recognising the diversity in our workplace and how difficult it may be for someone from a different cultural background to make a disclosure. And so being very sensitive to culture and diversity is particularly important. I think I've probably gone over most of this, but other support obviously can be their industrial entitlements, their job security. Many employers, particularly the bigger ones, offer things like financial assistance, and this might be advanced payments of salary, short-term loans of things like mobile phones or equipment to perform their work remotely and to stay connected, but also diverting salary. And this is something that is quite common, that when a person may be planning to separate from an abusive relationship, and perhaps there might be financial abuse or control, that getting themselves financially independent can be a crucial factor in deciding to leave that relationship. So workplaces might be able to divert a proportion of salary into a different bank account where the person who's using the violence doesn't have any access or any control over. And there's other practical things like keeping secure copies of personal information, such as passports, birth certificates, or the domestic and family violence order. So safety and confidentiality is probably paramount. The word confidentiality is paramount to safety, I should say. And while there's a risk, if there's a risk under workplace health and safety laws that other people at work should be informed, such as managers, there's also other circumstances where you may have an obligation to report issues of abuse. So this differs in different states. So for that information, for that reason, I've put in the link to the Australian Institute of Family Studies website, where it goes through state by state the mandatory reporting obligations in relation to child abuse and neglect. For example, in Queensland, certain professions have obligations to report child abuse. in the Northern Territory, there's a general obligation to report domestic and family violence. So we've got vastly different standards around the country in relation to this. So we've got a bit of time, so I was hoping that we would, because it'd be good to have a discussion around people using domestic and family violence at work. And we can see some questions coming in, but I will hopefully have an opportunity to respond to those at the end. So this question comes up in almost every training that we do. And I think it's really important to recognise that how workplaces actually respond in instances of people perpetrating violence within their organisation sends a really vital message in taking action against that violence or against domestic and family violence generally. So perpetrators or people who use domestic and family violence may actually be quite skilled at hiding their actions or convincing themselves and others that they're not responsible for their violence. Some common excuses or tactics can include blaming the victim for the abuse, minimising the use of their violence, blaming perhaps drugs, alcohol or stress, or inviting others to collude with their actions. So domestic and family violence perpetrators can be in any workplace. In a Canadian study, 2016, there was actually 2 studies identified how common this actually was. It was a study of perpetrators of domestic and family violence at the end of a men's behavioural change program. So they were quite open to being honest and open about their actions, and revealed that 44% of perpetrators had actually disclosed their violence to someone at work. What the frightening thing was that a very small number of people who'd received the disclosure chose to do anything to address the impact of the violence or the violence itself. So over a quarter of the people using violence also admitted using work time to perpetrate abuse, and that included stalking and the use of workplace resources. So this abuse and misuse of work time and resources could actually constitute a breach of an employment contract or of workplace policies and could warrant disciplinary action. However, if the domestic and family violence has occurred only outside of work hours or away from the workplace, the employer may not actually be able to intervene in a disciplinary way, except where it is specifically in relation to a breach of work policy or where it relates to reputational damage of the workplace. So once again, a complex area, and if you are an employer or a manager dealing with this kind of situation, it's probably a really good idea to seek some legal advice before taking actions such as dismissing an employee for perpetrating domestic and family violence. Obviously, there's things you can do like stand down, but you won't start giving industrial information. That's a case-by-case scenario. There's also, it's a tricky area, and it's not really for the faint-hearted to for someone to approach a work colleague who might be, or they suspect might be using domestic and family violence, even if there's been things like, you know, witnessing of the abuse or overhearing phone calls or seeing material that's inappropriate and indicates that domestic or family violence might be happening. But there's some great resources out there that we can also resource ourselves with now, and the bystander support program, MATE bystander support program at Griffith University, actually has some great information about the broader role that everybody can play in preventing domestic and family violence, not just having to go and talk to someone who you suspect might be committing violence. It's really important too to put your own safety first in these kind of situations. So domestic and family violence can be, I think, tried to emphasise, it can be a complicated and a pretty much hidden and unpredictable issue. If you do have workplace health and safety concerns, obviously having a framework that's already in place to guide you to respond, to uphold your responsibilities as a workplace or as an employee can be really, really useful. But, you know, it's not a perfect world, and sometimes that hasn't happened. So seeking that assistance from a specialist domestic and family violence service or one of the hotlines, and I'll give you the numbers for those in a moment, can actually be really useful in guiding your response. You know, domestic and family violence can result in serious harm and in some circumstances death. And it's not always obvious when these risk factors are present. So some of the specialist services in Queensland, and I've developed this mostly for Queensland, but if anybody needs any other resources, I'm very happy to provide them, and they're certainly provided in detail on the DV Workaware website. But for women, it's DV Connect. The general national number in Australia is 1800-RESPECT. There's a Brisbane Domestic and Family Violence Service that now provides 24-hour assistance. And there are domestic and family violence services in all regions in Queensland. The Queensland Government provides useful information about finding that service. For legal advice, Women's Legal Service. For migrant and refugee women, there's a specialist service, the Immigrant Women's Support Service, which has good information on their website and is also provides very free and practical information, including counselling. In North Queensland, there's the North Queensland Women's Legal Service. If you're stuck for a referral still, there's also the DAISY app, which helps you to find national services by regional area. And obviously in an emergency, it's 000. For men, nationally, there's Men's Line, and the phone number is there. It's general support and information for men, whether that's about experiencing domestic and family violence or using domestic and family violence. For First Nations people, there are specific services, but you know, it can be really challenging in the context that there's a lot of misconceptions about the violence that takes attention away from the deeper issues that really need the urgent attention. Our Watch has developed a very useful resource that I referred to before, and that's the link. E-safety can be really easy to underestimate and can be incredibly insipid and dangerous. So there's a not-for-profit expert in this area. It used to be called WESNet, but now it's called techsafety.org, and the address is there. And the E-Safety Commission is also particularly useful in recognising technologically facilitated abuse. There's some resources here from the Fair Work Ombudsman and from the Queensland Government about your responsibilities as an employer. And the Queensland Government's got a lot of information for workplaces about supporting employees affected by domestic and family violence. The Services Union has a particularly detailed model policy for paid domestic and family violence leave. And the Office of Industrial Relations also has, it's probably a few years old now, but it has a detailed guideline about preventing and responding to work-related violence, which can provide a useful framework that can be extrapolated to domestic and family violence. That link for safe work is also in there, and that's recently been updated, and it's got quite a lot of useful information. So there's some new resources available from the Services Union, a booklet, it's just a PDF booklet, and it deals with supporting workplaces to better understand and develop strategies for when domestic and family violence come to work, and the domestic and family violence safety planning tool that I mentioned before. Anyway, that's a long use of my voice, and we've got about 10 minutes left. But Carly, there's been some questions that have come in.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. Yes, just a reminder, you can ask questions in two ways. You can press the button that looks like a hand, and we'll see that hand come up, and we can unmute you if you have access to a microphone where you are. Alternatively, you can pop your question into the question box and I'll read those out. So far we've had a couple of questions that have come through. So this one's from Melody. So Melody's asked, how can the law protect employees from ex-partners bringing violence into the employee's current workplace?
Oh, that's a really good question. And when we say the law, I guess the most, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not purporting to give legal advice, but obviously aside from the criminal protections in the law around assault or breaches of domestic and family violence orders, we have got that onus of responsibilities on employers under the Workplace Health and Safety Act. So Melody, I hope that the presentation was a little bit useful to you in that regard, and certainly if you want me to take a deeper dive with you or point you towards some good resources, I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you. Now this one is probably something that's relevant just for, COVID times where everything's moved to a bit of a different format in terms of training and awareness sessions. So Helen has asked, What are some of the key considerations for the delivery of DFV training or awareness sessions in this remote environment?
Oh, Helen, well, context. Obviously, if you're responsible for developing domestic and family violence training or awareness sessions, then I think that the frameworks that I talked about that Queensland Government have promoted, recognising, responding and referring to domestic and family violence, can be quite useful. I think an essential part of domestic and family violence training is about fostering a more in-depth understanding of the dynamics of domestic and family violence. It doesn't mean that you need to be an expert, but some of the characteristics such as the cycle of violence, the fact that violence may appear to disappear, the long nature of violence, that it may not be a one-off situation that you're dealing with an employee. It could be something that goes on for years, and that we know that the data tells us that on average it takes a woman 7 times or up to 7 attempts to leave an abusive relationship. So workplaces or a series of workplaces may be on that journey with that person through those attempts to leave. And the reasons obviously that people go back to an abusive relationship are complex and multifaceted, and we dive quite deeply into those in our training. But just being aware that just leaving an abusive relationship may not be the end of it, and in actual fact separation can be the most dangerous time. So they're things that employers really need to be aware of when they're thinking about their interventions or thinking about what they're going to do to support, keeping safety of the employee as the primary consideration.
Great. Thank you. So this one is, I think, a bit of a multifaceted question. So I might try and deal with it in a couple of parts. This next one that's come through. So Renee, firstly, is keen to understand the responsibilities and best practice response for managers and HR staff if a staff member discloses domestic violence to them, particularly where there might be children at risk of harm as well.
Okay, yeah, look, it's quite multifaceted, and how prepared you are as a manager or an HR person or a contact officer can really inform the way you respond. So if you've done some training, if your workplace hasn't offered it, but you feel that it might be an area of your responsibility, there is training out there, and there's lots of information available on the web. The DV Work Aware website might be a useful place for you to start, and any domestic and family violence website, as well as the Queensland Government information. But I think if it's cold, if you're put on the spot, or you know that in an hour you're going to have a meeting with an employee who potentially has disclosed domestic and family violence or potentially is going to disclose, then you might arm yourself with a copy of your workplace policy or any relevant policies. You might arm yourself with a list of up-to-date referrals or supports that your organisation offers. And it's good if you are also aware, and most HR people would be, of what are the entitlements available in your workplace that you can support this person to access. So is it a case that they might need to take some leave to take steps to address the violence, and there's paid leave and unpaid leave depending on your sector and your workplace available to all employees in Australia. There's also things like flexible work arrangements, changing start and finishing times, changing hours, working less, working more, working in a different place. And that right to request a flexible work arrangement is actually entrenched in the Fair Work Act under the National Employment Standards. So employers have got a responsibility to really take seriously and consider any requests for flexible work in the circumstances of domestic and family violence.
Thank you. Hopefully that part was helpful, and there is sort of a second part to that question, which is something that often comes through, and Jessica has also put in a comment that's in the same vein. So really, I think this crosses over with your dual obligations, or if you do have obligations in this respect or not, about where there is potential harm to children. So sort of reporting obligations around that for employees. So do you have any comments on that, or is it
Oh,
something people should look at?
look, I think in terms of your actual individual state-by-state obligations, I would definitely check out the Australian Institute of Family Studies website. But we know that the ABS stats tells us that 2 out of 3 women had children in their care at the time that the violence happened. So the chances that the children actually are not only impacted by violence, but may also sustain long-term developmental, psychological or other harm is also really significant. So it's something that we haven't really gained, I think, a lot of literacy in the workplace context yet, but also asking the question, I think, when you're doing a safety assessment, what about children? If you have children, you know, what's happening for them, and getting some information without, you know, once again, privacy and confidentiality are really paramount, but you have to use your best judgment. You have to use your own ethical and moral framework to determine how far you go. But if you're actually aware that there's child abuse happening, I think that there's a significant onus on you now to report that to child protection.
Yeah, so I think that's hopefully clarified that for you, Renee and Jessica, and it is a little bit outside the scope of this presentation because we are focusing on employees. But thank you for that. It is something that's obviously front of mind in your workplaces. So I think, yep, great, thank you. A couple of thank yous coming through from Renee and Jessica there. So that's all of the questions that we've got so far. Oh, one's just come in. Every time I say that, it happens. This is just maybe a sense, Carrie-Anne, from your visits to the various employers around the place and working in this field. Do you have a sense that there are lots of workplaces that already have DFE workplace procedures, or is this something that's new?
I think it is still being rolled out, but the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, you may have heard of that or seen the acronym WGEA, released data that there's actually been a 30% increase in employers, and I think employers who report to them have to be bigger than 100. That now over 60% of workplaces who report indicate that they have got a domestic and family violence policy. So, look, I think we've got a growing culture of awareness. Smaller organisations and small businesses would be the organisations that would be, I guess, least likely and could also be, most vulnerable. But I know employer associations as well, particularly the retailers, are really getting on board in this area with providing their members with extensive resources to develop policies and procedures. I think it's a good idea to have one. It's the practical exercise of developing a policy and implementing it, if you do it well and if you consult and if you're genuine about the process, can really make a difference to the level of awareness in your workplace.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's all the questions that we've got. No, one last one. Sorry, Carrie-Anne. I think we've got almost a time, but we'll get this one in. Thanks, Carmen. So is there any information with regards to victims of domestic and family violence who are not wanting to seek help and support, and the impact that this has in the workplace and any repercussions for the employer due to these decisions? So I think, yeah, so if the victim's been given the support from the employer but they don't take that up.
Look, I think once again you have to respect individual autonomy and rights, and WorkSafe recognise this. I think I read some points out earlier that an employer can only be as aware as they can be about a particular situation. But once they are aware, it's like any other workplace health and safety risk, that you do have an obligation to manage that risk, and you get that, I guess, that conflict between confidentiality and privacy and taking effective steps. But I know that I think this goes for all areas that are tricky in workplaces and the pointy end, such as harassment and sexual harassment, particularly when people don't want to come forward and make complaints. Train everybody, make your policy universal, implement it universally. And so you're not singling out one individual, because if you've got a reasonable sized workplace, there's a significant chance that more than one person may have experienced or could be perpetrating domestic and family violence. So by making it universal and making it frequent, there's a saying and now it's slipped my mind, something about doing it very often keeps that at the forefront. It also helps to manage your risk as an employer, but having a culture of support does also encourage disclosures.
Excellent. All right, on that note, I think we'll finish up for today. Thank you so much for your questions, and there's some lovely comments coming through from our attendees. So on behalf of everyone who's watching today, thank you, Carrie-Anne, for presenting today. I will just mention that there was a slight update to the PowerPoint slides, so we'll get the updated version onto our website this afternoon when we send out the recording as well as some of the links to some of the resources and organisations that Carrie-Anne referred to. So if you could, we'd really appreciate you filling out the feedback form that will come up at the end of this presentation, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great
day.
afternoon.